Well, I am Feda Baeza, a trans woman based in Buenos Aires who teaches, writes, and curates exhibition. And I am very glad and excited for moderate this conversation between McKenzie Wark, based in New York, and Helen Hester, based in London. For this series of dialogues organized for the editorial Caja Negra. If I have to think relations between the production of Wark and Hester, I have to say that both authors give us resources to rethink the horizon of transfeminism by questioning the idea of identity and the essentialist notion of body nature. In these approaches, the difference between culture and nature is obsolete in the landscape of capitalism. Wark thinks about the interventions on consciousness produced by raves and drugs. Hester discusses the need to politicize interventions on the body and generate strategies that hack biopolitical control systems. Let me emphasize, hacking gender technologies is a need that runs through the trajectories of both authors. Another similarity is found in the tone of their writings. They are not afraid to challenge the commonplaces of the left-wing feminism and right-wing feminism too. They intentionally seek controversy. This is a remarkable position to be able to continue thinking about horizon threatened by neo-fascist dystopia of our days. I thank you both for this opportunity. Next, I'm going to ask some questions to give the conversation. Obviously, feel free to ask each other questions or answer something different than my original question, obviously. Okay, quiz will start. Starting from the concept, feminism and xenofeminism, what is your perspective of feminist and transfeminist movements today? Who can we challenge the contemporary trans-exclusionary positions?
Helen, you want to try that first?
I can. I mean, I want to start by saying that I feel like it's something of an insult to you, McKenzie, to be compared to me on the level of stylistics. I think I'm sort of...
no, not at all.
Oh, well, I mean, I think you're such a beautiful writer. And I don't think that is one of my strengths at all. But I do agree that there's actually quite a lot of conceptual crossover, not least because you are one of the influences on my thinking. So of course that's going to sort of seep through in some way, or at least I hope it seeps through in some way. So yeah, so great question to kick off with. And it's one that sort of makes me think back to when we being Laboria Cubonics, published our Xenofeminist Manifesto back in 2015. And that was a period, I think, in retrospect, where there was far greater cultural consensus in the Anglophone nations around bodily autonomy, whether in terms of trans rights and self-determination, or in terms of the right to choose and the wider notion of reproductive justice. So this, of course, this moment, it wasn't a moment of sort of trans utopia by any means, and acceptance was always kind of qualified or tenuous, or it was somewhat precarious in one way or another. And indeed, I remember sort of looking back to that time that I was involved in a blockade of the Department of Health here in the UK, sort of fairly shortly after the manifesto was published, precisely protesting unacceptable deficiencies in trans healthcare, which was, as it remains, sort of inaccessible, under-resourced, and delivered by undertrained, and sometimes flat out hostile providers. But that sense of public support, the sort of prevailing winds, the direction of travel, and also of potential institutional gains, for me, that felt very different then to the conditions that we currently face. So thinking about that, I was asking myself, well, why that shift? And I think there are those, and I have seen them, who would accuse trans rights activists, so the so-called TRAs, the caricature, of being too greedy in their demands. They've been accused of having brought about the downfall of their cause through overreach. They've been too assertive, they're too unpalatable, they're not humble enough, all that kind of thing. And this is despite the fact that much of the activism of the 2010s was deliberately pretty careful, I think, in a lot of ways. So I can recall parts of it really leaning into discourses of respectability, for example. You know, there've always been really beautiful, radical trans voices, of course, but in the mid-2010s, as now, there were also more assimilationist tendencies. And these, at times, for very understandable reasons, seemed to be pleading primarily for tolerance. You know, well, we can't help it, we're trying to be normal, please forgive us. You know, rather than kind of simply asserting that all trans people, all people, deserve to live full, free and flourishing lives. And that's not just white, middle class, passing, gainfully employed trans people. And so that is something that we touch on in the manifesto when we write, so this is a quote I've got up here, while having perhaps admirably expanded thresholds of tolerance, too often we are told to seek solace in unfreedom, staking claims on being born this way, as if offering an excuse with nature's blessing. All the while, the heteronormative centre chugs on. Now, even that kind of born this way approach is seen to be asking too much in some quarters. You know, the cultural shift has arguably fostered a certain, and again, very understandable, hesitancy in some people. You know, I've seen talk of efforts to roll back or soften or reframe demands that have been accused of being too radical, asking too much, and causing somehow the tide of public opinion to turn. And so even really very modest demands, you know, those that will utilize these assimilationist approaches, find themselves being caught up in this moment of hesitancy. And for me, what that really brings home is that this whole sense of backlash is not in any way because of overreach. You know, it can't be attributed to an excess of ambition or, you know, some sort of lack of political nous or proper decorum. Rather, it is precisely the result of very generously funded campaigns against the rights of trans people. You know, these are campaigns that draw on the resources of wealthy individuals, some of them very high profile, Christian organizations, conservative foundations, right-wing think tanks, and things like that. So these are enemies that are often shared between branches of the struggle for universal bodily autonomy. You know, the reproductive justice movement being one obvious point here. But we're all sort of facing this confected controversy, the very deliberate construction of a problem that centers around hospital wards and toilets and changing rooms and women's refuges and locker rooms. And the idea is that these spaces are being newly imperiled by this kind of transgender ideology, this menace that's fueled by sort of this hallucinated idea of sexual deviancy, opportunistic cis men, and practices of gender self-identification, which are themselves then framed as a kind of unregulated and dangerously untested novelty, which is despite self-identification being a very well-established practice, including in places like Argentina. But the rise in anti-trans sentiment, and I think this is really important, it hasn't fostered a kind of blanket quietism. I'd argue the opposite, in fact. You know, despite some of these voices telling us you've gone too far, you've pushed too hard, there has been a sort of rise in radicality in other quarters as well. Parts of trans activism are in a space in which people feel they can be much more full-throated, much more widely unapologetic than they perhaps felt they could be a decade ago, precisely because the environment has apparently become so much less hospitable. So there just isn't the buy-in anymore from people with sufficient influence over the sort of juridical, political, economic, social levers of power to produce very much in the way of meaningful institutional change at this point. And obviously that is a very depressing reality. But that also means that the perceived need to kind of curry favor, to make yourself seem reasonable, that gets diminished in some ways. And that's something I think to really build on to ensure that no trans person gets kind of thrown under the bus of respectability politics, no matter how sort of queer or weird or disreputable or difficult that person might be. And so just to kind of start rounding this off before I ramble too much, it's this sort of, with this renewed sense that assimilationist demands are unlikely to gain traction, we might consider becoming still more unreasonable. So there is this move away from what I call engineering type approaches, these approaches that aim to build more accommodating systems, towards hacking type approaches, which look instead for exploits within existing systems. So we're reminded of the importance of retaining a certain capacity for biomedical self-defense, the skills needed for direct action, the knowledge and the networks that are needed for survival. And we're very clearly confronted with the fact that we mustn't lose that hacking mentality ever, not even in sort of times of relative opportunity, because those gains can always be rolled back. And we don't want to find ourselves without these kind of DIY type skills. So there's no room for complacency, and that extends very much to those who stand also against forced pregnancy, who find themselves in some senses similarly embattled in certain places in the world at the moment. We cannot allow ourselves to be de-skilled, as we are ultimately our own last line of defense. But I would also suggest that this applies in the other direction too, and I think this is something that's going to come up at various points in this conversation. Even in periods such as ours, when it feels like the possibilities and the opportunities for positively transforming political and social and medical institutions are rapidly disappearing, we don't want to stop pushing for institutional engineering as well. So a hacking mindset is fundamental, it's absolutely to be celebrated, but the need to hack is also reflective of a kind of disempowerment. You hack something to make it do things for which it was not expressly intended in some ways. So it's not enough, right, to kind of think about rooting around barriers or staging disruptions within a given system. We have to also strive towards the creation of new systems, better systems. We want a more hospitable world in which we can, but do not have to hack. A world of systems that we don't need to be constantly turning against their original purposes, because they were in fact designed with a more accommodating set of affordances in mind. So for me, that would mean systems that take bodily autonomy to be axiomatic, systems that support universal provision of abortion, pre, post and perinatal care, HRT and gender affirming or gender disruptive healthcare and so on, that's free, that's safe, that's accessible on demand. So one key aim of a xenofeminist politics of technology should be to transform political systems and disciplinary structures themselves so that autonomy does not always have to be covertly seized. And I just want to keep that horizon in mind, even as we are in this situation right now where we're inevitably fighting fires and struggling every day for care and joy and daily reproduction in much more immediate ways.
Yeah, thank you for that, Helen. I think we're sort of very much on the same page, so I don't need to sort of go over that. I did really treasure that spirit in the Xenofeminist Manifesto of kind of like a broad-based sense of the implication of the body and technology is kind of like a given, like there isn't a natural body to use as a reference point. So, like let's play with it and see what's possible in the framework of the sort of interaction of the body and techniques. And, like trans people are only one example of that. And, and one has to be on board with people, like doing things with techniques of the body that you aesthetically or politically disapprove of, like pretty sure there's men at my gym who like juice testosterone to be more macho. And it's like, well, good luck with that, honey. It's fine with me. Your mood's it's going to affect your mood. I can tell you what'll happen. But so it's I think we have to get off that this sort of cultural feminist framing where there are like good versions of what you do with the body and bad ones. Where you sort of set yourself up as moral arbiter. It's like let the human play in the space of techniques. Like why not? I think we have to think about the wisdom of the strategy and the, sort of going back now 15 years of thinking that if you present trans people in the guise of a subject demanding rights in the public sphere through its visibility, black trans people in the United States were saying, this can really not work. This can go to a bad place. Like visibility is not your friend. And I'm kind of right about that. And I kind of think strategy in the sort of communities I'm involved in at the moment is sort of very much about what can we do that's much more discreet, less visible, to support each other to sort of get through what's quite frankly an era of scapegoating. Uh, the sort of like mass anxiety about the unsustainability and impossibility of life, and the seeming boundarylessness of it needs a scapegoat. And trans people aren't the only one. The undocumented are the other big one here in the United States. But we were sort of one of the sort of early identified scapegoats. If we're excluded, then everything goes back to normal. We'll know what gender is, and we'll have differences we can manage and all that sort of thing. And it's kind of just depressing to see that, yes, as you say, this was sort of like largely a kind of project of the far right, uh, but got amplified, by Guardian UK uh, in the UK, by the New York Times, by the Atlantic, by dead legacy publications, like desperate for any influence, like picking this low-hanging fruit of like, oh, there's something we can go after to kind of create traction and give the sort of bourgeois punditocracy some sense that it still has relevance by sort of conceding this one to the right. So yeah, it's like New York Times is what it is, but the absolute, dereliction of any journalistic duty is kind of like bit of a tragedy to see. Like we know you can't trust any of these fuckers on foreign policy, but to see them on domestic policy, print straight up lies about us is really not fun. So, all right, so what alternate information circuits, what alternate archives, what forms of mutual aid? So yeah, we just have to sort of hack the available tools to create the possibility of ongoingness for trans people. And within the United States, that also means migration. There's like 20 states people essentially have to leave. That's difficult. Like moving is expensive and complicated, and the places you need to move to have like ridiculously high rents. And for a lot of trans people, the only available work is going to be sex work. So how do you create networks of survival that are a little bit like what it was, back say in the 90s, but also not, like also different. People who didn't know they were supposed to hate us now know that's part of the agenda. Like it's like that's the other downside of visibility. Like people like trying to clock you all the time now as well. So yeah, like to think, all right, so there's kind of a defeat of a sort of liberal strategy of inclusion. So what other strategies are available? And we have no control over how we're perceived. So, like trying to be like a more respectable target is not always going to work. And there's lessons from ACT UP, which pursued every possible strategy at once. ACT UP at one and the same time had like, super respectable gay men in suits, interacting with policymakers, but it also had people doing mass die-ins, so it was sort of like we're going to like come at you from every fucking angle. And I think it's a little bit that at the moment. And it's a little bit a question of then who's available for what kinds of strategy and who's not. And whose work isn't political at all. Like who is, it's and that's the other thing. You tell the story of ACT UP, and it's like a whole bunch of gay men and lesbians doing stuff. Where were the trans women? Like they were actually taking care of people who were sick. Like that's they were doing the care work. Like who keeps those pieces together is sort of worth paying attention to as well. Like there's the political frame. There's also the cultural, the social, the technical. There's so many levels of this that need to be engaged with at once so that we endure because we're not going away.
Okay, well, let's talk about some strategies to hack this system. Could we say that the rave and the idea of public luxury are linked? How would you articulate the possibility of a post-capitalist desire in our contemporary cities? How to pose the common or collectivized resources in a scenario where the form of collectivism has been desecrated?
Yeah, I think, like in raving, I'm not pretending that this is in any way outside the sort of gentrified, hyper-commodified city. Like the romantic myth of the outside is one to sort of really have done with in the 21st century. but within that space, how do you turn a little corner of it towards your own needs? One of the things I found really delightful about good rave is like everyone works really hard, but all we're making is essentially heat. You know, the space heats up and gets really humid. It's like sauna, by morning. And there's just a certain pleasure in, like, I think many of us feel like that our actual work is always fucking compromised. Like we're always working, within a sort of an economy where, you try not to have the most evil job, but there is no non-evil job anymore. Like everything is compromised. So, all right, let's just like spend the morning working really hard, making absolutely nothing. All of this labor goes into, we're just going to heat the space up and like trash our bodies for the morning. So there's just sort of that pleasure, and it does tap into that sense of thinking outside of sort of like efficiency, logic, and even that Stakhanovite, sort of left wing sense that like that all of labor has to be productive in some sense. It's like, nah, it is just gonna be the pure luxury of the body in play and in movement for as long as we can do it. It's not, it's not utopia, it's not resistance, it's not the underground, it's not transcendence. It's, I was like looking for a different language. Like none of this applies. I was there in the 90s when we tried all those things, like for God's sake, it is not a temporary autonomous zone. We just fucking stop saying that. I'm so over it. It's a party. But there's an art to it, and there's a techniques to it, and it's very hard to do well, and it requires most of the people who are there to know how to do it. It's not a spectator sport or a consumable. It's a thing that, like you bring a piece of it with you and put it into play. Uh, so yeah, like to me, it's sort of like the most interesting art form of 21st century, and it's got roots in 90s rave culture. I missed, the English version of rave culture completely, but I remember Berlin and I'm like, all right, see how this works. But actually it's kind of better. I think where it got to is better than at least the versions of it I was aware of. Europe and Australia and so on. So, the sound is better. Like the plug and play lighting is like way better. Wider range of drugs are available to tweak, the sensorium in it. So yeah, I think that's kind of, and there are reasons I think that people are looking, particularly for the sort of flavor that techno gives to a party. There's a sort of abstractness to it. There's a lack of the liturgical. I love house music, but to me, it's connected to Black gay culture and it's connected to church, and I don't belong in that. But here's a kind of more abstract sonic space, and also one that's going to give time a different kind of texture, where time will sort of pull out sideways. Like I think we're, like the idea that you would, like accelerate 21st century political economy and get anything good out of that, that ship has sailed. Like moving this thing any faster will just break it sooner, and that is so obvious. So, uh, but also if you pull on Walter Benjamin's handbrake, it's like Looney Tunes; it just comes off. So, what are the strategies to kind of build possibilities? And my metaphor for that is sideways, like to think about a different kind of temporal environment, a different relation to time. So yeah, I think that to me was why rave seemed to be a place to talk about temporality, aesthetics, excess, surplus, what's to do with surplus, uh, and what it is people need emotionally at a time when we realize good futures are very, very hard to pull off at the moment. So yeah, it's hence that book. And then to find a new language for all that sort of really resonated, and particularly in the Spanish world, like that book got around, it's sort of like that's of my things, that's the one that sort of touches readers in a particular way. Because it's like, how do you get conceptual language and everyday experience of particular people to connect? Like to me, that's theory. Like that's particularly what I call low theory. Like that's the goal of it, is to get that, how do you get conceptual thinking that doesn't require you to have been in graduate school for 20 years to so you start to perceive your world in a certain way. You don't have to accept it, like concepts are just provisional, but to sort of get you thinking and feeling about life in its collective and personal possibilities.
I love that answer, and that sort of the rave is sort of a battalion share in some sort of way. I also love the question as well, because it taps into this idea of public luxury, which is something that I've been thinking about in my work, and it's precisely an idea that's grounded in sort of abundance, right? So in which public service exceeds that which is sort of strictly speaking necessary for basic day-to-day existence. So not just seen as being about ensuring that people have access to the things they need to survive and live their daily lives, like healthcare and public transit and childcare and elder care and food and shelter and all those things, but also about ensuring a quality of access to the things that will enhance our lives. The classic bread and roses idea, right? So I think libraries are always a great example of this, because they provide access to books and other media, as well as the sort of, I guess, the informational or the communication kind of infrastructure that's needed to then access knowledge and entertainment. So that's free internet on the one hand, but also just offering a place to gather, a place to be with other people. And, we could consider parks and galleries and museums and playgrounds and studios and maker spaces and things like that as falling somehow within this bracket of public luxury. I really need to talk to my friends at Caja Negra to make some recommendations for English language texts on this. But they introduced Nick Cernacek and myself to Argentina's history of social tourism programs, which were designed to provide holiday opportunities for the working classes. So from what I can gather, having spoken to them, during the Perón administration, the state built tourist resorts and started to frame leisure as a kind of right for everybody. And I actually feel like that basic idea is so important in terms of finding ways to reduce unequal access to experience, to adventure, to relaxation, to pleasure. We are, as I think McKenzie's answer starts to make clear, we're finite creatures on a finite planet. And in some ways, I think we owe it to ourselves and to one another to ensure that as many people as possible are able to do things that will bring them joy, that will enrich their lives in ways that are more equitable and also more sustainable. Now, whether the rave is a matter of public luxury, I think is a more specific issue, because for me, the adjective public immediately evokes this idea of public services, essential services provided by local or national governments to citizens. And while I think that notion of public might, under certain systems, provide a suitable scale of administration at which to organise things like trains and buses and water and electricity and sewers and bin collections, even libraries and leisure centres and that kind of thing, it's not necessarily a framework through which we'd want to conceive of meeting all human needs. Because I think for me, a state-sanctioned rave, like a state-sanctioned orgy, seems like a horrifying prospect. And again, I think this for me stresses the need to ensure a certain tension or a kind of equilibrium almost between hacking and engineering approaches, because every system produces the conditions for its own disruption. And this potential for disruption is an inevitable part of systematicity. And McKenzie is the expert here, of course, but I'm reminded of her comments in Raving about some of the pleasures of the illegal rave coming precisely from its status of illegality. So I read and I really enjoyed that book, and it seems from her observations that, and I think that again, this comes through in the comments that you've just made, McKenzie, that there's almost an emergent property to the rave, that it has to come not only from the people who organise it, who engineer it with a view to having a particular effect or a particular affect, but also from the people who turn up to participate in it. The crowd can foster or skew or kind of flat out destroy the vibe. And McKenzie writes about the importance from her perspective of ravers who need the rave in a certain way, who provide the dynamics required to sustain both their own experience and the rave as a collective experience at this kind of certain sweet spot of intensity. Well, elements of this can be designed in. So we've spoken about the lighting design and so on. We've spoken a little bit about the music itself, almost as a sonic technology for producing certain states of experience. I think a great deal is unpredictable, like it's situational, and it's impossible to fully legislate for in advance. So for me, I would sort of want to move away from the idea of centralized resources and planning and services, which again, I would say work for some things, towards, in the case of the rave, maybe an imaginary of communities that might find less restrictions on their ability to engage in independent somatic experimentation and other forms of sublimity and pleasure seeking. And I mean, this is probably less like a matter of a grant system to support the organisation of events. You know, the National Rave Council. Although it refers to that, but you know, it's more a matter of imagining a world in which kind of the abundance of public services might allow a wider range of people to kind of take part in raving. You know, if you've got free, high quality 24-hour childcare centres, I would certainly experience an immediate uptake in my participation in nightlife, for example. You know, if we have sort of pleasant, reliable, plentiful night buses and trains and tubes, that would ensure that people could get home safely, and 24-hour workers' clubs, rest stops, nocturnal social spaces, that would better help to meet the needs of night workers, including those who support raves and other kinds of nightlife. So that's kind of thinking about this in terms of how we create the infrastructure around a rave that might better enable the emergent event itself to flourish on its own terms, rather than seeking to bring it into a realm of services that we can deliver, perhaps through a kind of a particular version of a public luxury framework.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the United States never really had a social democratic tradition. You know, like I'm from Australia, which did. You're from the UK, which did. You know, it's this sense that there were things that the state was able to achieve, like national health. And in Australia, we did that a bit later, but there it was. So that there's, I think, a much stronger sense of the role of public in that sense. Because think about it, right? These raves that I'm talking about, they're not public.
No.
They're what I would call the uncommons.
Mm.
You know, they're for those of us who actually can't be in common spaces comfortably. So there's a filter. So it's sort of like in between private and public, and very much a thing that creates its own economy. You know, because like you pay to go, right? And those drinks aren't cheap. So it's kind of operating its own subsidiary economy. So yeah, I kind of would have loved to have seen a continuation and revision of the social democratic tradition, you know, which unfortunately in the UK, that option's been shut down, and in Australia it is as well. We have a Labor government there at the moment as well, which is no longer, is that in name only kind of thing. Yeah, so it's kind of, to me, a shame to see an entire movement that I spent my life in, you know, sort of descend into kind of managerialism. Uh,
Mm.
but that's where I find living in America is kind of interesting, because it's like, well, that never worked here in the first place. Like the coalition to build it wasn't there. So there's always been these other strategies that you can sort of learn from, that are a little bit more a little bit more anarchist flavored as well, of like, all
Yeah.
right, what kind of structures is it possible to build?
Mm.
Um, but and it's a point you've made elsewhere as well, to think about like what's the middle scale that is actually available. It's not about smallness, but it is about different kinds of structures, and infrastructures of sort of ongoingness, and how do we build those and where?
Yeah, I guess sort of like instead of public luxury, like common luxury or uncommon
Yeah.
luxury as being a way of framing it in a more sort of with a more anarchist bent, rather than something that we is delivered from the top down but can flourish from bottom up and creating the conditions for it.
Yeah, you know, and we see this in, I think, like, you know, like a national, like a social health system is a really fucking good idea, right? And I wish the United States had that. The thing that is obviously a constraint on that is if you've got one system, you can shut trans people out of it. It can be racist and no one will pay attention to it, you know. So that there's sort of tensions we need to acknowledge around social provision, as who constitutes the social in this in social.
Mm. Yeah, I mean the classic problem of universalism, right, is who's
Yeah.
excluded from your version of the universal,
Yeah,
and how
exactly.
if it's possible to re-engineer that concept, or if it has to be abandoned. And I tend to think, you know, 12 of one, half a dozen of the other, in terms of
Yeah.
like, actually it's context specific in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Whether
That's
the universal is a
yeah.
useful tool in its context.
Yeah, I agree. It's a tactical question. It's not
Yeah.
philosophically interesting. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Helen, for the thought about the politics of leisure of the in Argentina. Let me, for example, give another local story. I don't know if you have heard about the sons of Javier Milei, our president. You know that he has 5 dogs that he calls my 4-legged sons, that they are products of a treatment of clonation of other original dog that calls Conan, that Millet used to say that he speaks with this first Conan. And it's interesting because Millet says that this is my family. These 5 dogs are my family. So some interspecism frame that he has, and this is very interesting. And like McKenzie says, the answer is who has the possibilities of this biopolitical treatment, and who's not? Because paradoxically, you know that Javier Milei, it's a great defender against the abortion and other politics of the intervention in the body. So, do you have some opinion of this strange situation that Argentinian gives?
Yeah, I mean, why shouldn't people clone their animals if they want to? My only question is, why would you want to? Like the whole thing about a companion, an animal companion is you have to let them go. That's sort of the whole point, They pass through your life and out again. Yeah. Yeah, one could think, what if we started with the cheapest, easiest end of augmenting the human? Like what are the ordinary everyday things? What if people could get insulin for free in the United States? So if you have diabetes, you could just regulate that without wondering if it's like, oh, I can either have food or insulin this month. Like that's a real thing, and it just makes me so angry that that's sort of where we are in this country. But like rather than pay attention to the sort of outlier luxury version, to sort of like start with basic things, because like luxury can also mean just sort of like little everyday things rather than something kind of grandiose, just like that little like free play in the day that a lot of working people just don't have. Cigarettes are luxury to a lot of people. And so that's all just massively taxed, to punish working class people for, like your break's only 15 minutes. What are you going to do? You have a cigarette, because it's like 15 minutes of pleasure. Like let's just, what if cigarettes were free? Provided by the workplace, plus a place to go have it where you won't bother anybody else, So yeah, I kind of want to, where does our focus land in thinking about these things? And like the Fabian principle was, the incremental overcoming of unnecessary suffering, and that to me is just, I'm not a Fabian, politically, but the principle of that, strikes me as like just incredibly important. Like, what if we refloated that? But then what's the other side of that? What's the incremental addition of unnecessary pleasure? Like what would be I think that's the other side of that, and maybe it's a more appealing project if you add that. It's like, oh yeah, all right, so I want you to be to not suffer where you don't have to. Like suffering's inevitable if you're human, but let's reduce how much of that's really unnecessary. But then, pleasure is possible if you're human. Like, what if we start adding like little elements of that? When I was in Chicago, it's fucking freezing there, and all the trains are above ground. There's like part of the platform that's heated, and I'm like, what? You can just be warm on this outdoor platform in the middle of winter, Like I wish New York had that. It's like it's glorious. Just like you're waiting 50 minutes for your train and you're not fucking miserable, freezing cold. Like that to me is where luxury starts, you know.
Yeah, I think this thing about the dogs, which I had heard about, it's kind of it's sort of a useful reminder to us as well of sort of the autophagic dynamic of repurposing, right? So I think there's a tendency that when we start thinking about sort of posthumanism or like interspecies connection, we feel like we're always speaking from a position of sort of like moral ethical clarity, that this is an ethical decentering of the human. But there's way to imagine hybrid families and interspecies families that aren't like that don't automatically map onto a sort of suite of other political commitments. Like actually there are lots of ways to engage in new materialism and posthumanism and interspecies thinking that don't lend themselves to what I would consider to be wider emancipatory projects. So it's a useful reminder just to like never assume that one coordinate explains the whole. It's connected to a wider totality. And there's plenty of people who are, I mean, I think we particularly see that at the moment as sort of hippie ideologies bleed into sort of like right libertarianism. And you see this kind of happening all the time, that this scrambling of the ethical and political coordinates, like you actually have to take each element and consider it rather than assuming that you're starting from an automatic starting point to some sort of like ethical superhighway. Like you have to be thinking about every aspect of your own politics rather than assuming that there is a shortcut to doing the right thing in any circumstance.
Okay. Well, we can think in another utopia of the far right. That's the face of the dog of the future, like the child. Okay. Other question. How to escape from technological realism? Will your hacker be able to question the logic of capitalism platform? What technological fantasies do they have? Does it make sense to rise other possible technological utopias that have a real impact on transforming our present?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of an untold story of the struggles internal to some of the famous big tech companies between their leadership and their workforce, where like workers, and it's part of the shift to the right of what I call sort of like vectorless class, clearly like move rightward in its political commitments, but part of it was to shut down questions from their own workforce. Because clearly these companies are moving heavily into surveillance and military applications and things like that. And they're getting pushback from their own workers. And so you kind of see, like an internal, and it is in a certain way a class struggle. It's just not in a recognizable traditional form, where, at the all hands meeting, like just where regular workers are in the same room as their bosses. That's what's unique about tech. This doesn't happen in most industries, right? And regular workers are like, why is the leadership all white people? Or, like, why are we doing like military research? Or why are we collecting this data we don't need that's invasive? And you sort of see a ruling class go, shut that the fuck down, like, because their only motive is growth, right? These things have to continually grow and grow and grow. So any question that impedes that's really not welcome. So yeah, I think there were people who had other versions of what any technology could ever have been. Like technology doesn't have an essence, it's a site of conflict and struggle and negotiation and regulation. It's a complex object. But yeah, I think there's a bit of an untold story of, and there's a century of this too, of struggles where, scientific and technical workers sort of asking questions and trying to organize and sort of, and part of their concerns are conditions of labor, like a traditional labor movement, but their other concern is, where is this thing going? Like, we're being asked to, like, not just make a product in a workplace. We're designing future workplaces, and we'd rather them not be like that, And obviously, as with like traditional working class had a lot of people who are very attracted to far-right authoritarian ideas. Being a worker doesn't automatically make you a socialist, and likewise, a lot of, kind of what I call hacker class of intellectual workers are co-optable, but not all were or are. So I think to sort of pay attention to those struggles is kind of important. And I think we've seen some significant defeats in terms of questions being asked about AI that and the answer is shut the questions down. So that's definitely headed in a particular direction. But like struggle goes on. Like you lose more than you win. But I can't go on. I'll go on, as Beckett says.
Yeah, it's I mean, when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking again about this sort of hacking engineering framework that I've been kind of leaning on throughout this discussion. I don't know why it just kept coming back to me as I was thinking about that question and some of the other ones. I think because questioning the logic of technological realism, it's not just a top-down endeavor. It's not a matter of just proposing a large-scale, systematic, utopian alternative. Because, and again, I think McKenzie has touched on this already, that this kind of questioning happens all the time in these routine, kind of quotidian ways, in the daily application and development of kind of know-how and techne. Like, it happens in the way disabled people are constantly innovating their way through a world that just isn't designed for them. For example, they're changing the way that something sits or something hangs, or how something can be reached and grabbed, or how it can be opened or closed. This is a sphere in which things are not necessarily being turned against their original uses, but in which they're being made to better fulfill their original purposes for users who just weren't initially considered. And this manifests in a lot of ways. From my own life, I'm thinking about the way that my father uses a backpack to transport oxygen with him around the house, and also in the way that he's kind of got this makeshift wayfinding that he's created to assist my mother, who has dementia, find her way around the house. And as well as, there's a whole suite of much more high-tech adaptations within and beyond the home as well. So this really is, I think, a sphere of huge ingenuity, huge creativity and innovation. Of course it is, but it's also part and parcel of the ongoing cognitive drain of navigating a disabling society. As such, I think we should, again, be pushing for a situation in which that kind of unevenly distributed need to invent one's way through the world is diminished, precisely because different people are factored in and they're considered really right from the off. And I think we might also make a similar point about something like biohacking. So biohacking also relies on kind of knowledge sharing approaches to create kind of DIY workarounds to existing technology. And as I've suggested in some of my own work, biohacking can arguably be understood as a form of cyborgian witchcraft. It's one which is sort of in keeping with the tradition of radical amateurism that facilitates practices of bodily knowledge and technological know-how that might otherwise be sort of occult. They're concealed, they're inaccessible. But these practices can also fall within quite different paradigms. So let's think back to McKenzie's gym bros here. These are paradigms that stress the imagined perfectibility of human brains and bodies. So whereas my version of a biohacker is very much somebody engaged in kind of politicized community, circulating knowledge and know-how that's designed to perhaps extend reproductive autonomy or gender self-determination, there is equally a version of this figure who biohacks in isolation, subscribes to kind of far-right grifters who promise super male vitality through scientifically questionable supplements, and also billionaire tech bros who are trying to live forever by siphoning off their children's blood. And I think while the ideal xenofeminist biohacker might be this kind of a do-it-yourself, do-it-with-others member of sort of a feminist collective, or perhaps a garage hobbyist, or perhaps someone like Mary Magic's housewife making drugs, they are not the only kinds of biohacker, and there are also whole other modes of biohacking. So socio-technical practices that are developed via biohacking are very much at risk of being incorporated by and adapted to the needs of centralized institutions, not least the kinds of institutions that I work with, universities. So, and when they are sort of co-opted, it happens in a way where many of their more radical edges very quickly get sanded off, right? So, and McKenzie noted this sort of more than 20 years ago now, that the ruling class seeks always to control innovation and turn it to its own ends, depriving the hacker of control of her or his creation. And patents and copyrights all end up in the hands, not of their creators, but of a vectorialist class that owns the means of realizing the value of these abstractions. So this would indicate that hacking needs to be this sort of ongoing structural orientation towards the disruption of systems. So it's always a perpetually unfinished endeavor. And I think, once again, that it should perhaps be thought of as one tactic amongst several for pushing back against technical realism. But even if, as the Xenofeminist Manifesto suggests, we need both an engineering and a hacking perspective, we need both to overrun existing and emerging systems and to build better systems, I think it's also important to remind ourselves that division itself doesn't hold in a lot of ways. It's a sort of false division. We're not talking about rival teams here. We're not talking about incommensurable approaches, but we're talking about two lenses that are, in some ways, and in particular circumstances, sides of the same coin. So while hacking certainly depends upon the system it hacks, that doesn't mean it's incapable of altering these systems as well. Precisely because as a network responds, as it adjusts to kind of an encroachment, it can change its own topography. It can become something different. And this suggests that while the structural relationship between system and disruption may be inexorable, in the sense that really any attempt at systematicity will always invoke the threat of interference or disturbance, the specific expression of this can be made subject to change, sometimes, in some ways. So I think in certain circumstances, challenging the system also means changing the system for good or ill. And as such, it can fuel this form of re-engineering. And I think for me, that's really a key term, this idea of re-engineering. Because at the same time, engineering can never be thought of as some kind of pure innovation, right? We can never assume it's independent of what's come before it. So in other words, like technical utopias necessarily emerge from the very present that they seek to transform. Every possible transformation emerges from existing conditions and is constrained by the materials at hand. And, it's a very Marxist point, really, that nobody makes technical systems under freely self-selected circumstances. To various degrees, we are all constrained by restrictions that we inherit, and there's no clean slate. There's no sort of fresh or untainted system. Just intervention within existing frameworks, things that are transmitted from the past and not of our own design. And for me, I think that's an idea that's very much at the heart of my own brand of xenofeminist sort of accelerationist politics, which is accelerationist in a very different sense from the sense that McKenzie was talking about earlier, because it is precisely, it's like a reparative approach. It's one that seeks to build from where we are, to build from the ruins, in this kind of full acceptance of the very precious things that we've lost, but which refuses to give up on the idea of a transformation, which is not necessarily something worse, but perhaps something better, or at the very least something different. That's that kind of sideways move that McKenzie was thinking about earlier.
Thank you for the generosity of your answers. Effectively, we have to contract with the existence pieces of us. And the last question that I want to give to you, and it's the question of the experience of the writing theory. I know that McKenzie has an autoethnographic methodology to write. You, Helen, for example, in After Work, works with the data of the everyday life like a resource to think the transformations of the public luxury or our free time. So I want to ask you for your methodologies, your intuitions, in your ways to write.
I'm just thinking of that, when you write the grant application, you have to answer the methodology question. And I'm like, I just like read some books, think about shit, and and look around. Like, how do I put that in fancy language? Yeah, and how do you? I think I'm very much drawn to, and yeah, Helen's right. Of course, obviously, one works in a context that one inherits, but I do always want to find how much of it's unthought. Like how much are we just repeating habits of thinking and writing, and how do you break those? How did Marxism becomes sort of like Marxology, where there are just these truisms you have to sign on to that are never questioned. And I'm like, Carl didn't think like that. That really wasn't what he was about at all. He was like really trying to break out of a set of assumptions and do something different with language. Yeah, how much does and to me it seemed like a bit of a limitation that we sort of separated out research and the writerly. I think working on language itself is then also part of the research. Like how do you move the language on a little bit? I always wanted to, the enemy to me was always like bourgeois common sense. And so you can outflank that in a number of different ways. And I think I was trying to outflank it in the past by, to be more abstract. There's sort of like a middle voice, middle mind, middle thought, sense that a lot of bourgeois thinking has. And it's not abstract enough. Let's really push on that. That's Hacker Manifesto, game of theory. But then it's sort of like you can actually outflank it on the other side, like sometimes bourgeois thought is in the first person, but it's actually not really very personal, it's not the material texture of the body is absent, So let's sort of try to get around it the other way, and I think in the next book I'm trying to do both at once, so we'll see how that lands, So how do you get affect, percept, concept in the Deleuzean language? How do you get all three, in the same sentence? That would be ideal. So it's like blocks of how you perceive things, the effective resonance of it, but then the concept that holds it, how do you get all that to work? And yeah, it's sometimes you have to kind of coin things and break things. So yeah, I was immediately attracted to Xenofeminist Manifesto because it's from the start, it's all right, let's make up a word for it, and it's also the word's really cool. Xeno is a really good prefix, because Xeno, Xenia is the stranger, it has all these classical resonances. Ironically enough, for a thing that's very future oriented, it's this is reaching deep in the bag of language to pull something forward and repurpose. It repurposes who and what the stranger is, So yeah, that's really fucking cool. I wish I'd done that.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear and very,
yeah.
very generous. But it's also something that you've got a lot of beautiful coinages. You're excellent at all of that kind of thing. And I felt in many ways that this question was really for you, that because it has this auto-fictional. Maybe I'll tack my own question onto this, and I can come back and give my own answer in a second. But this sort of this auto-fictional element of it, because as I've mentioned to you, the two most recent texts that I've read by you are Reverse Cowgirl and Raving, which are texts that both strike me as being engaged in this kind of somewhat similar endeavor, in the sense that both of them set out to represent something unrepresentable, and then to a certain extent to kind of theorize the untheorizable as well. And that's also something that the texts themselves reflect on at times in a really sort of beautiful, engaging way, which is the kind of asignifying quality of intense states of embodiment. And I would just like to sort of selfishly take this opportunity to invite you to talk a little bit about maybe the challenges as well as the pleasures of bringing the concept into conversation with both fucking and raving, because it seems to me that writing, and specifically theorizing even, which is, I think, is quite a denigrated form of writing, is it becomes this other source of sort of deep satisfaction for you. It's no less embodied as a pursuit, and it runs through your auto-fictional work. But perhaps it also opens up a different kind of trajectory or a different register of pleasure to the things that are the primary focus of those texts. So I wondered if you had something you wanted to say on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I could have kept writing, like Hacker Manifesto, like forever, but it's like I did it, like I did that. And actually, I kept, there's always like overshoot. I kept writing like that. And it's like, I already did that, So yeah, how to sort of not be too wedded to one particular approach to language, and how is like a particular sort of like genre and lexicon and stuff like that, how is it giving you particular readerships? um, I mean, I wrote a Hacker Manifesto in an imaginary language that doesn't exist. Like, it's written in European, which is equal parts church Latin, business English, and Marxism, So it was a book that was made to be translatable, at least to that chunk of the world. And it was, like, it worked. That book is in 14 languages, I think, at this point, Um, and I can actually make sense of most of the translated versions of it. Like, even in Hungarian, you can pick out the abstract nouns sort of from those three registers, Uh, so that was that experiment, but I don't need to do that again. And the other factor in this is transition. I became a much more marked subject. So, like, if you're excluded from being, like in the sphere of public discourse, you have to find some other strategy where being the sort of unmarked subject is not available to you. And it's like, well, I'm just going to really double down on the most cursed kind of transsexuality there is in reverse cowgirl, which is, let's do autogynephilia, for 100 points, So that was that one, because I didn't find that book. Maybe it's out there, but it wasn't available to me. So it's like, who found transition through gender euphoria? Like, where's that story? And one we were forbidden from telling for a long time too, Uh, so yeah, I think the yeah, I kind of have wanted to write in a more abstract, but then also like much more particular kind of voice. And I think the next thing is to try like thread those back together again a little bit, But it's a little bit wedded to I think in my case being a writer first. Like I think what you're doing comes from the research and then a social political project around that. So I think you've adopted different strategies for different purposes. So it wouldn't have made sense to write after work other than in the language that it is, right? Because it's aimed at engaging readers in a particular way, So I think the larger story is like thinking about that, of like, how do you do intellectual and creative work that has, political cultural resonances that approach your intended readership in a way that they can connect with. I think I also want to slightly trouble a too obvious reading a little bit, and one doesn't always want to do that, but I definitely do. To sort of outflank the received idea about what it's supposed to be that's already there. So yeah, it's all about tactics for how you put a text in circulation in the 21st century, which is very different to how it was, when I was coming up. Like, there was a certain place that the book had, or the theory had, and it doesn't anymore. So you need to reinvent all of that, So that's the game, and that's the thing I decided to spend my entire life doing. But it's funny reading Lacan again, which, it's been a very long time, but that whole thing of like embrace your symptom, it's like, oh yeah, I did that. Not a Lacanian, but it's like, oh, it's like, yeah, just embrace your symptom. It's like, yep, mine's writing. That's my pathology.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid using the word jouissance at any point in the question to you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the pleasure, pain, necessity of, yeah, what that does. Yeah, like some of the best times I ever had in my entire life was writing.
Okay, okay. Well, as you said before, uh, it's impossible to come back in this neo-fascist dystopia. We have to go further. We haven't another possibility, and I think that your approaches have the value to produce this kind of controversy of the things that we assume that it was good before this global mess, and give us the possibility to think some other futures that we are producing in your writings too. So for me, it was a pleasure moderate this conversation.
I just got to say thank you, Caja Negra. It's just my favorite publisher to work with, like anywhere. And has got my work to circulate in the Spanish-speaking world in a really extraordinary way. So yeah, it's just been a delight to do three books together, and it got me to Latin America, and that was a real pleasure. So yeah, I just really love the sort of editorial strategy and the communication strategy and the design strategy of what is actually my don't tell my other publishers, but what is actually my favorite publisher.
Yeah, I'd have to second that. It's a wonderful publisher to work with, and I've really enjoyed all my collaborations with them and meeting some of their staff in person in various places. And I'm so grateful for the support that they've given to the work. And I really hope there are future opportunities to collaborate with them.
Yeah, 20 more years.
Yeah, 20 more years. Do it.